Hearing none, motion is approved. Senator Gatchalian is recognized.
Thank you, Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, may I propose to the good sponsor to just park Section 22 for now? We gave our proposals. However, there are still some discussions whether to accept or how to tweak that proposal, Mr. President. And I have succeeding proposals on Section 22 as well. And admittedly, Section 22 is the core of this bill, the meat of this bill, Mr. President. So if a good sponsor will allow, we can park this for now so that we can think about it. We can also come up with compromises and counter proposals, Mr. President.
Mr. President, earlier before we suspended, we regretfully delivered our response that we were rejecting the amendment of His Honor. But of course, in the interest of still finding a compromise, we had a fairly lengthy discussion. And unfortunately, Mr. President, as His Honor knows, this is the heart and soul of the bill. And this representation has made lengthy explanation, including the chart that we showed on the screen about how for the past 14 years, the price of indigenous natural gas has been extremely competitive. It has mostly been on the low side. We reiterated the provisions that are currently in the bill, and it is our position that this is necessary because we want to really promote indigenous natural gas, and the only way we can do that is to really ensure that when we develop the industry, there will be buyers for indigenous natural gas. And this is not a scenario, this is not something we're inventing. Aggregation is very common in many countries, and doing this is really the answer to our ensuring energy security for the country, Mr. President. So that is our position. If His Honor at the end of all this still has additional proposal, it is my duty to always listen to my colleagues, but for now, this is the response, and we are rejecting that proposal, unfortunately.
Thank you for the reply, Mr. President. And Mr. President, I heard the arguments of the good sponsor, Mr. President, and if she will allow, we can table this for now, the entire Section 22, and I will submit to her. Actually, I've already submitted to her our proposal, but we can also submit some counter proposals, and just to give us some time to think, Mr. President, and also not to belabor the point, Mr. President.
Are we going to deliberate it after all the
Well, as far as
amendments?
this representation is concerned, there is no counter proposal coming from us. It has already been rejected. So if His Honor wants to work on it, of course, I will entertain, but I've officially rejected the amendment already, Mr. President.
Well, Mr. President, if that is the case, Mr. President, unfortunately, I am of the opinion that this is a very important proposal to make sure that we can deliver the lowest price to our consumers. Mr. President, we took a look at, personally, I took a look at the entire repercussions of this proposal, Mr. President, and this provision will impact our consumers directly. So we thought about this, and we carefully analyzed the provision in this bill, Mr. President. Unfortunately, our proposal is to have transparency from the onset so that we can assure our consumers, we can tell them that they will get the lowest price possible, Mr. President.
Well, just to respond, but I've already pointed it out, the word transparent is very clear in the opening sentence of this section. So in terms of assuring customers of transparency, nandiyan na po yun. And anyway, I think I've belabored the point,
Yeah.
Mr. President. I'd like to move on.
Mr. President, if so we can, if the good sponsor will allow, I have succeeding amendments, Mr. President, that is related to the first amendment so that we can clearly see the entire picture. May I propose that amendment? And if the good sponsor still feels that that amendment is unacceptable, then we can vote on the entire amendment, Mr. President, because it's all interconnected, so that I will not make one amendment after the other, if the good sponsor will allow that.
May I know from the sponsor what page did we finish your last amendment?
My last amendment, Mr. President, is on page 21. I think that's the last one I read. Page 21, the last one I read, which was already approved.
Mr. President, my amendment is on page 19,
So
Line
this is an
18.
Anterior amendment?
anterior amendment, Mr. President.
All right, please proceed.
Mr. President, I'll read my other amendments because it's all interconnected. And we can decide on that later on. On page 19, in the same line 18, delete the phrase over imported natural gas. On the same page, in line 20, after the word supply, delete the word administrative. On the same page, in line 21, delete the phrase or any other arrangement allowed by DOE. On the same page, delete the paragraphs from lines 22 to 25. And on page 20, these are all interrelated, Mr. President. On page 20, on page 20, line 2, before the word indigenous, insert the phrase power from. On the same page, line 2, replace the phrase in the generation, transmission, distribution, and supply of power with the phrase over power from the other conventional energy sources whenever the price of power from indigenous gas is equal to or lower than power from conventional energy sources. And on the same page, in lines 4 to 7, delete the phrase, this includes requiring electricity suppliers to source a portion of their energy supply from power plants that use indigenous natural gas and determining the appropriate minimum percentage of the power generation mix that should be supplied by natural gas power plants that use indigenous natural gas. So those are my amendments, Mr. President, on Section 22, Mr. President. And it's all interconnected, Mr. President.
Yes, thank you for that, Mr. President. We reject those amendments. The provision that we have approved is a provision that is acceptable to this committee, and unfortunately, NDOE, in consistent with our objective of pursuing energy security and the best prices for the consumers, Mr. President. We feel that the provision we have is sufficient to cover consumer welfare and competitive prices, which I know is the goal of His Honor, Mr. President.
Senator Win?
Am I done with-
1 minute suspension, Mr. President.
Session suspended.
Walang bidding. Walang bidding.
Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
My next amendment is on page 21, or sorry, 28, but if his, sorry, page 21. Does his honor have anything, any prior amendment?
No, Mr. President. So we will, just to clarify, so we will park section 22 first, Mr. President.
No,
That's
I
the-
think the sponsors has already rejected your proposal, so there's nothing to park already. It has already been rejected by the sponsor.
But Mr. President, would like to appeal to the body.
Session suspended.
Suspension.
Na defer without prejudice to you appealing later. Tomorrow. Hindi naman natin close kasi yung amendments.
Tinanong mo, ba't nawala yung picture? Ano ba rin? Hindi makakasin. Hindi alis.
Prejudice to appealing to the body, ano, office of the sponsor.
Prejudice to
No, I will latest tomorrow morning. Diba? Para at the earliest tonight, latest tomorrow morning.
Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
President, the parliamentary status is I have a pending appeal to the good sponsor on accepting the several amendments that I proposed earlier on Section 22. I've conferred with good Senate President, and he mentioned that I make my appeal tomorrow morning, or tomorrow during the session, Mr. President. So we
So you
can
withdraw
move
your
on
appeal?
to the next provision
All right.
without prejudice to the appeal that I will be making to the body.
All right. Senator Piaz, you have the floor.
Yes, we noted, noted.
Thank you,
So,
thank you,
yeah.
thank you, Senator Pia, thank you.
Does His Honor have any amendment before Section 21? Because otherwise I'll proceed with page 21.
Page 20. Page 21. We have on page 21, Mr. President. On page 21, line 9, after the phrase act, insert the.
Before His Honor proceeds, my last amendment was, I deleted, did you take note of that, just so your amendment takes that into consideration? Deleted uncompetitive and replaced it with anti-competitive.
That's on line 9, Mr. President.
Line 9,
Sponsor.
yes.
Let me just look at the copy. Okay, Mr. President. Okay. Mr. President, this is a different proposal, Mr. President, and with the permission of
Okay,
the good
please proceed.
sponsor. Yeah, let me just propose it. In line 9, after the phrase acts, insert the phrase provided that the separate business entities shall be established for each PDNG facility or activity, provided further that owners and operators of LNG storage and regasification terminals shall be prohibited from owning an interest in TPA conventional transportation system and vice versa. I so move, Mr. President.
What does the sponsor say?
Can we get the rationale of His Honor?
Well, Mr. President, it's by allowing the LNG owners of storage and regasification, and at the same time, owners of the pipelines, the conventional transportation systems. The pipelines will only be one, just like NGCP, that it's only one. But if it owns the source of the LNG, then obviously he has the power, or that entity has the power now to dispatch LNG from his own assets or from his own storage and regasification terminals. That's why in the case of power, NGCP is prohibited from owning power plants and also distribution utilities because it's a natural monopoly. And at the same time, it's also the system operator. It traffics where supply and demand should meet. So in this case, we're also applying the same concept to pipelines, or what we call here conventional transportation systems, Mr. President. So that's the rationale, Mr. President.
Noted. I mean, it's suspension. I just have to study this.
Session suspended for a minute.
Mr. President,
We're still in
oh, sorry.
session resumed.
Mr. President, there's also a first proviso, Mr. President, and the first proviso is simple. The owners of PDNG facility and activity will create a separate business entities. And the reason for that, Mr. President, so that they cannot commingle pricing, as well as it's easier to unbundle charging mechanisms, Mr. President, because if it's one and the same, then it's very difficult to unbundle pricing, Mr. President. So what we requested from the good sponsor is to mandate entities to create separate business entities for different units so that pricing will be much easier to unbundle and to analyze, Mr. President. So that's the first proviso.
I have a question, Mr. President. Will these separate business entities also be prohibited from owning an interest in the transportation system if the other separate business entity owns the storage and regasification terminal?
Yes, that's the intention, Mr. President.
Okay, so I'm trying to study this very carefully, and this is our scenario. We are a very our natural gas industry is, how do I put it? It's in the infancy stage. So currently there is a regasification and storage terminal being built. And so if we now will pass this, then this investor in the storage and regasification has to wait until an investor decides to build a transportation facility. It will delay these projects, Mr. President, because we are really in the infancy stage. I understand what His Honor is trying to prevent. You know, we don't want a monopoly, that no one can come in because there's only one player. But we're in the infancy stage, and the transportation is almost like an accessory to the storage business, because they'll have to find other investors, and then, you know, it's not as if we have so many people investing in this. There's a line for people to invest. There's so many people who want to. That's not our situation right now. So perhaps this proposal may be ripe in a decade or two, but right now, even the existing storage storage and regasification plant, what will they do if we ban them from investing in their distribution? I don't know how we would proceed, Mr. President.
Yeah. Mr. President, how about the first proviso that we propose, the creation of separate business entities? That goes with the first sentence, Mr. President.
If His Honor's concern is the price transparency, perhaps we can improve the language on that note, because that's what His Honor was explaining
Yes, Mr. President,
earlier.
because if it's one entity, for example, you have the pipelines and, let's say, the storage facilities as one entity, it's very difficult now to unbundle the rates, because obviously everything will be put together in one rate, and it's very difficult now to promote competitiveness or competition in that industry, because it's all bundled. It's very hard to analyze. That's why in the power sector, there's also a mandate to unbundle rates so that it's easy to analyze. But in this case, the first proviso allows common ownership. It's just you have to set up a separate business entity, Mr. President. So that is the proposal.
suppliers to submit relevant information.
Okay. Mr. President, I'll bring His Honor's attention back to the provision that we were debating for quite some time earlier today, entitled Natural Gas Supply. It says there that if necessary, the DOE, ERC, and PCC shall require the suppliers to submit relevant information pertaining to supply contracting, procurement, pricing, and distribution scheme to users for purpose of monitoring. So this is where the unbundling can probably be elaborated on, if His Honor would like to make a proposal there. Because if that is the intention, no, that's why I appreciate His Honor explaining the rationale, because I'm also trying to find where we can include that. I don't know if it is necessary for them to have separate business entities. In my mind, those are corporate options. They might want to run as one entity for various reasons, administrative, for tax purposes. I don't know. I can't give an answer as to. I cannot offhand say that we will. I cannot accept that amendment just because there may be repercussions that or intrusions on the rights of these corporate owners. But I do accept His Honor's concern on the unbundling, and maybe that could be tackled in some other provision or with some other language.
Mr. President, if the good sponsor thinks that the power that we incorporated in Section 2 to DOE, and then we expanded it to ERC, then PCC, for purposes of monitoring, in her Honor's knowledge, is this enough to mandate the entities to unbundle? Because that is actually the intention of this is to unbundle through separate business entities. No? Because if you have separate business entities, you have to file different documents. So if that is the suggestion of the good sponsor, that Section 22 can deal with the mandate of unbundling, I think this representation can take a look at that position.
I was getting the opinion on this also with DOE, and they agree that it is sufficient for purpose of requiring unbundling, Mr. President.
All right. If that's the case, Mr. President, I am withdrawing the amendment,
Thank
Mr.
you.
President,
Thank you.
just to put that on record that there's already sufficient powers to mandate entities to unbundle. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Does His Honor have anything more before page 21?
No more, Mr. President.
Okay, so I'll proceed with my amendment on page 20, this is section 28 on own use. On page 21, line 19, after the phrase approved by the DOE, insert a new sentence which shall read as, the DOE's approval shall specify the standards and limitations thereof. We submit.
Any objection? There being none, amendment is approved.
Mr. President, I have an anterior amendment on page 26, Mr. President.
We're not yet there. We're on page 21.
We're still on page 21.
Sorry, Mr. President. Sorry,
Sorry,
Mr.
I think
President.
Are
you
you
got
with us?
confused because I said section 28.
Sorry, Mr. President.
So my next is still page 22 and then page 23. So pwede ka muna umupo, Mr. President, Mr. Sponsor.
Ay, wala na yan.
On page
Wala na ngayon.
22, line 6, after DOE,
Remove that.
insert a new sentence which shall read as, the DOE's approval shall specify the standards and limitations thereof. We submit, Mr. President.
Any objection? There being none, amendment is approved.
Thank you. The next one, Mr. President, is on page 23, line 10. Delete the phrase, the TPA permit holder of the PDNGI facility shall have the authority to release and market the same, and replace it with, the DOE shall have the authority to direct the release of the same. We submit, Mr.
Any
President.
objection? There being none, amendment is approved.
And on the same page, delete line 12 to 14 and replace it with, the procedure and criteria for the release shall be governed by the TPA code. We submit.
Any objection? There being none, Amendments approved.
Thank you, Mr. President. The next one is on page 24, after line 11, insert a new section which shall read as follows. Section 35, Safety Standards. The DOE, in collaboration with the NREB and PNOC, shall develop and implement safety standards of natural gas, including renewable gases, in order to address their unique properties and risks. This is an amendment of Senator Hontiveros. We submit and ask that the succeeding sections are renumbered accordingly.
Any objection? There being none, amendments approved.
Thank you, Mr. President. My next one is on page 26, line 4. Does His Honor, the gentleman from Valenzuela, have something before that? Page
Yes, Mr.
26,
President.
line 4, yes?
Line 4, Mr. President. Delete, section 26, line 4, delete the word "and" after the semicolon. I so move, Mr. President.
What does the sponsor say?
Well, we accept in principle, it's just the word "and," and I also have that amendment, so we
okay.
accept that.
Okay. Any objection? There being none, amendments approved.
Mr. President, I have more amendments on the same page. On the same page, after line 4, insert the following subsections and renumber the remaining subsections accordingly. Letter L, establish and maintain a decommissioning fund at the start of the PDNGI facility operation to be utilized for its decommissioning. Letter M, unbundle and make available to the public their unbundled rates and fees if applicable. Letter N, not engage in any anti-competitive behavior, semicolon, end. I so move, Mr. President.
What does the sponsor say?
Mr. President, I need a minute suspension to study the matter. Thank you.
Session suspended.
Ready to resume, Mr. President. Go ahead and discuss.
Session is resumed.
On the first letter, what was that, L, no? The establishment of a decommissioning fund. The only reason we did not accept that in the written submission is because it is already required by DNR. But we are very happy, subject to style, to say something to that effect. That,
Okay, Mr. President.
as provided by, I don't know if it's a DNR regulation or.
Yeah, we can cite the regulation,
Yeah,
Mr. President.
we can.
We can
Okay.
do the research also and cite the,
Okay.
subject to style,
Okay,
cite the
because that is
regulation.
acceptable. The unbundling, there's just a discussion going on here on my right side with DOE. And then on the last one, we have a similar amendment. Well, it is yours, which we accept,
Yeah.
not engaging in anti-competitive behavior. So we also accept that.
Thank you,
So,
Mr.
Mr. President, there were 3 items enumerated. Were there letters? The first and the third are accepted. The second is still.
So how will this section read?
So, I will ask for a suspension again because I will be, so I can respond to the second item, which is,
All right.
I'm not yet ready to respond to. Thank you.
Thank you.
Session suspended.
Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
So, we are prepared to accept the 3 items submitted by His Honor. The first is subject to style. The second one on unbundling, I just want to give a reason why it initially was not included in those that we accepted kasi kinasuhan daw ang DOE
Yes, oo.
dahil dyan. But in principle, they're
Walang legal-
okay with it. So I said, so let's accept it. So
Yeah.
so basically, all His Honor's amendments
Right.
are accepted, subject to style, for the first item.
Okay, any objection? There being none, the amendments are approved.
Thank you, Mr.
Subject
President.
to
Just
stand.
to add to that, Mr. President, that's precisely why we included the unbundling, is because of that case filed by the downstream oil players, because DOE released a circular to mandate them to unbundle, so that we will exactly know how much they purchase, how much is the transportation cost, how much is their profit take. But fortunately, that it was struck down because there's no legal basis to that
Okay.
effect. So we're now putting the legal basis,
Okay.
Mr. President.
Thank
So,
you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Are there any more, Senator
So-
Gatchalian? On page 26, before the sponsor makes her own amendments.
My next one is on page 26, line 11. So,
Yeah, Mr. President, I.
and it is also your
yeah.
amendment.
Yeah, Mr.
So-
President, I think we have the same amendment to that effect.
Senator Cayetano, you can proceed
Yes,
with
okay.
your amendment.
So on page 26, line 11, delete the phrase "other activities in relation to the," and then on the same page, line 11 to 12, delete the phrase "value chain projects" and replace it with "facilities." We submit.
Any objection? There being none, amendments approved.
And then on the same page, line 12, delete the phrase "be included in Tier 3 of the," and replace it with "undergo an evaluation process for possible inclusion in an entitlement of incentives under the." We submit, Mr. President.
Any objection? There being none, amendments approved.
On the same page, line 16, delete the phrase "moreover, the registered project shall also." And on the same page, delete line 17 to 22.
Any objection? There being none, amendments approved.
On the same page, lines 23 to 24, and continuing to page 27, lines 1 to 14, transfer the entire subsection II to page 26 after line 18 as a new paragraph. We submit.
Any objection? There being none, amendments approved.
On page 27, delete lines 15 to 17. We submit, Mr. President.
Any objection? There being none, motion's approved. Do you have any other
But,
amendments?
Mr. President, we submitted that amendment to her
Yes.
honor, and it
Yes,
was
before
carried.
Senator Pia Cayetano proposes her amendments starting on page 28, do you have any other amendments on page 28?
No, Mr. President. I
Okay,
don't.
Senator Pia, you may proceed.
The next amendments, Mr. President, are fairly simple. On page 28, line 7, delete 16 and replace it with 18.
Any objection? There being none, amendments approved.
On page 28, line 13, delete section 32 and replace it with section 33.
Any objection? There being none, amendments approved.
On page 28, line 14, delete section 33 and replace it with section 34.
Any objection? There being none, amendments approved.
On page 28, line 15, delete section 34 and replace it with section 35.
Any objection? There being none, amendments approved.
On page 28, line 17, delete 35 and replace it with 37.
37, not 36.
37.
37.
Yes, 37.
Any objection? There being none, amendments approved. Tumalun eh.
Tumalun na. Thank you for noticing, but it is correct. On page 29, line 1, delete section 37 and replace it with section 39.
Any objection? There being none, amendments approved.
Thank you. The next item, Mr. President, is on page 30, line 9. After the word assignee, insert a new sentence.
Before you
Ah, yes.
propose any amendments, Senator Gatchalian, do you have any amendments?
Yes, Mr. President,
On
also the
page-
same, page 30, line 9.
Yes.
Line 9?
Yeah.
This
What
is
is your-
yours. This is your
Okay, it's the
amendment.
same amendment, Mr.
Okay,
President.
please proceed, Senator Pia.
So on page 30, line 9, after the word assignee, insert a new sentence which shall read as, provided that this applies to sales of shares that would result in a change in control of the permit holder or its ultimate parent. We submit, Mr. President.
Any objection? There being none, amendments approved.
On the same page, delete lines 10 to 11. This is also a Senator Gatchalian amendment.
Any objection? There being none, amendments approved.
Mr. President, just on that same line, lines 9, after the word assignee, we actually talked about this. I have another addition, a proviso towards the end of that amendment, And the proviso reads as follows: provided further that the assignment or transfers shall not be allowed near the end of life of a PDNGI facility. And that was discussed earlier, Mr. President, that we will clarify this, that the transfer should not allow circumvention of decommissioning and
Yes.
other costs, subject to style, Mr.
Yes,
President.
we accept that, Mr. President, and we will we'll work together with His Honor for the wording on that.
All right.
Thank you, Mr.
Okay.
Mr. President. With the indulgence of the good sponsor, when she started earlier, I missed the first parts, Mr.
Okay.
President, and I have just a few items on the first parts, Mr. President. On line 16, page 2, line 16, delete the.
Page 2?
Page 2, Mr. President, because I missed the first parts, Mr. President.
This is an
Anterior, yeah.
Okay.
I thought the proposed amendment came from the proponent.
Came from?
Yes, Mr. President.
Came from whom?
From the proponent, Mr.
The
President.
proponent.
Okay.
So on page 16,
Oh,
on page 2, line 16, delete the phrase, "the financial viability of the PDNGI by liberalizing," Mr. President. And the rationale for this, Mr. President, the financial viability is a business decision, and entities who are going to go into this business should obviously take note of the financial viability of their business and also of the industry. It's not the responsibility of the government to assure the financial viability of those entities going into this industry, Mr. President. So that's the rationale, Mr. President.
what does the sponsor say?
I'm studying it, Mr. President. I need a minute. Thank you.
Session suspended for a minute.
Resume.
Session resumed.
Mr. President, we initially rejected this because it is really our belief that we need to promote that environment where coming to the Philippines and investing in indigenous gas is really something that is going to be supported. We know very well, we've had numerous discussions in Create and Create More on creating that environment. Having said that, we understand His Honor's concern, and although we stand by that principle, I'm just happy to accept it because it's not really a big, it's just a declaration of policy.
So you're
And
accepting the amendments?
yes, in the hope that His Honor will not have any more.
Mr. President, just a minor amendments, Mr. President.
We will.
Accepted,
we will
without
act on
conditions.
We will act on the amendment, your proposed amendment. Is there any objection? There being none, the proposed amendment has been accepted by the sponsor. Any objection? There being none, amendments approved.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, on the same page in line 18, after the word attaining, replace the phrase fair prices for all stakeholders with the phrase low-cost energy prices pursuant to Republic Act Number 7638 or the Department of Energy Act of 1992. And this is for consistency purposes because in RA 7638, it calls for low-cost energy price, Mr. President, as one of the core mandates of the DOE, Mr. President. So just for consistency purposes, Mr. President.
We will wait for the reply of the sponsor.
Yes, I need a minute, Mr. President.
Yes. Session suspended.
Sure, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Yeah. We'll reconsider, Mr. President, and accept it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President, for...
Is there an
the-
objection? There being none, the proposed amendment has been accepted by the sponsor.
Thank you, Mr. President, for the reconsideration. I thank the good sponsor. On page 3, line 1, replace the word reasonable with the word low cost. I so move, Mr. President.
Replace the word.
Replace the word reasonable with the word
We
low
already
cost.
accepted that when we read His
Okay,
Honor's
Mr.
earlier
President.
amendments.
All right, Mr. President. Sorry, Mr. President, if I will repeat some of the amendments because I
It's
missed
okay.
the
I'll
first
just
part.
let you know if it's already
Yeah,
been
okay.
accepted.
On the same line, after the word pricing of natural gas, insert the phrase pursuant to Republic Act Number 7638 or the Department of Energy Act of 1992.
Yes, that has already been
Okay.
proposed and accepted.
Thank you, Mr. President. On page 3, line 7, after the word aggregation, accepted nito. I believe this is
We
accepted.
accepted
already.
also.
All right, Mr. President. On page 4, line 11, before the word taking, insert the phrase that will result to a least cost price end. So moved, Mr. President.
So, Mr. President, that one was rejected for the reasons I have been explaining earlier about the importance of looking at the bigger picture, looking at the long term, knowing that the indigenous gas has been lower by far over the span of many years. So the assurance that the exact specific lease cost as proposed by His Honor would be the determining factor. We cannot accept that, Mr. President.
Senator Win?
Yes, Mr. President, I'm just, sorry for the delay. I'm just reading the provisions once again, Mr. President. So, Mr. President, one of the reasons for aggregation is to use the supposedly low price of indigenous gas and then mix it with supposedly higher prices of LNG. And the objective is to bring the price down, Mr. President. So if that is the objective, Mr. President, then putting the word least cost remains consistent with that objective. I remember during the interpellation, Mr. President, Her Honor mentioned that the indigenous gas throughout the years remains to be very low. And one of the ideas or one of the concepts of aggregation is to mix it with imported LNG because imported LNG supposedly is much more expensive. No? And the goal there of mixing or aggregating in this sense is to achieve low cost or least cost for the consumer, Mr. President. So the proposal just assures the consumer that aggregation will lead to least cost, Mr. President, because that's eventually that's actually the core idea of why we are aggregating, Mr. President, is to take advantage of the low price of indigenous gas, Mr. President. And that's also the concept of aggregation in other jurisdictions, Mr. President, to take advantage of the low cost of supply and mix it with imported supply so that we achieve on the average a competitive price for our consumers, Mr. President. So it's just formalizing that idea, Mr. President, into this provision, this proposal, Mr. President. So it's not deviating. This is only insofar as aggregation, Mr. President. So we're not talking about the prioritization as what we have discussed earlier in Section 22. This is only to aggregation. And aggregation, the objective is to average out the cost. What's the point of aggregating if the prices will not go down? So that's one of the key ideas of aggregation, is to take advantage of the low cost, supposedly low cost of indigenous supply.
His Honor is not incorrect, no? But when you look at the bigger picture, the purpose of aggregation is lower cost and also securing a stable natural gas prices, because the prices, as I have shown with imported LNG, fluctuates a lot. So when you aggregate, you ask the different importers to buy in bulk. Let's buy in bulk. So for example, importer number 1 can buy this small amount. Importer number 2, maybe a little bit more. Importer number 3, small amount. Together, they increase their purchasing power. So that is one on its own, just the purchasing power of these importers on LNG, imported natural gas alone. And then you bring in the picture of indigenous natural gas. The objective here being is energy security in addition to lower prices. So when you combine it, there may be days that it's extremely low compared to what's out there. There may be days that it's even lower, and there may be days that it's not so low. So I cannot guarantee that every single day that you compare the price, it will be the least cost. But in the long term, it is definitely a lower cost because you have a bigger, it's common sense. It's the law of economics. Marami kayong bibili, yung purchasing power mo malaki. So clearly, ang patutunguhan doon is mas mababang presyo. And then the same with the indigenous gas, mas marami din ang pinapasok natin na mag-invest dito, mag-explore, mas bababa yung price. But on any given particular day, I cannot predict that every single day it's the least cost. Kaya ako hindi makapag-oo sa inyong proposal dun sa mga salitang the least cost. Pero tama ho yung logic nyo, na yung patutunguhan nitong aggregation is to be able to improve our bargaining power and to get the best possible prices, the best price in the market now. Maybe tomorrow, biglang bumaba yung presyo yung nabili natin today, hindi kasing mura nung tomorrow. Pero because marami tayong bumili, at least okay pa rin. Para kung bumaba na hindi naman natin kasi makpe-predict yun. But we're always better. We always have more bargaining power when we are doing this as an aggregator, Mr. President. So just that phrase, least cost, I can work with His Honor if there's other language. It's just that I think we agree in what we're trying to achieve. I just don't want to give false hopes in this statement that every single purchase is the least cost.
I understand the explanation of good sponsor, Mr. President. I'm looking at the powers that we give DOE, and in this provision, it's required to come up with a minimum percentage, Mr. President.
Yes.
If we can introduce some language, I'm open to giving DOE that power to also make sure that prices are low, prices are competitive, something to that effect, Mr. President, subject to style, Mr. President. So it's not just resulting to least cost, but let DOE come up with a mechanism other than the minimum requirement, but also taking into consideration or putting it into the equation competitiveness and low prices. Something to that effect, Mr. President.
Yeah, I don't mind, Mr. President, like something to the effect that says bearing in mind that aggregation will
Taking into consideration.
Aggregation will result in the best possible prices,
Yes.
things like that.
Something
We're
like
open,
that.
Mr. President.
Yes, Mr. President. We'll just submit to her sponsor, the good sponsor, language to that effect.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. President. We'll submit that later on. And on page 4, line 16, after the phrase Section 4B of this act, insert the phrase that will result to least cost price, which is the same concept, Mr. President.
So same.
Same, so we'll submit,
we were on it, yeah.
so the concept that we will be submitting is to give DOE the power not only to determine the minimum percentage, but also competitive pricing or
Yes.
Some form of pricing formula.
Maximizing the power of aggregation.
Yeah, yeah. Right. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, that's it for this representation, and I thank the good sponsor for her patience, for her openness, as well as for her generous explanation of some of the provisions. And thank you very much to Senator Pia for her patience. Maraming
You're
salamat.
very welcome, Mr. President.
Senator Pia, do you still have any more amendments?
No more, Mr.
Ano
President.
more?
Mr. President,
Wala na ba talaga? Still early. Oh,
Mr. President, I move that we suspend consideration of Senate Bill number 2793. So move, Mr. President.
any objection? There being none, motion's approved.
Mr. President, we have several